Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Unstoppable with me, your host, Kerwin Ray. And today we get happy. We're getting a happy chappy with Dr. Tim Sharp, who is also known as Dr. Happy. He has 3 degrees in psychology, not 1, not 2, but 3, as well as a long record as an academic, clinician, and coach. And we're going to be covering everything from creating greater states of happiness in yourself to the relationship between being happy and achieving success. This is going to be an incredible episode when you consider that people who are already happy are 78% more likely to achieve success in their life and their business. Let's get happy. Listen up. Dr. Tim Sharp, thanks for joining us, mate.
Thanks for having me.
Mate, absolute pleasure. So I'm curious to know, like, they call you Dr. Happy. How did you get to this point?
Well, I didn't call myself that, I should clarify to begin with. And in fact, to be honest, it was a bit of an accident. I got years and years ago, my background was in clinical psychology. And then about 15 years or so ago, I shifted to positive psychology. So I started to talk a lot more about happiness.
The Martin Seligman movement, yeah?
Exactly. So about the very, very early days of that, when I first started doing it, no one in Australia had even heard of positive psychology at that point. But anyway, I used to do a lot of work with a friend and a colleague in organisational consulting, and we do what used to then be called work-life balance programs and stress management programs. Anyway, cut a long story short, one day, and I've talked to him since, and he said he didn't even give it any thought, but he signed off an email saying, "See you, Dr. Happy." And it, I must admit, initially I was quite reluctant to adopt it because I had without sort of being too immodest, I had a good reputation at the time. I was sort of well established. I got several degrees in psychology. I thought people aren't going to take me seriously anymore.
Yeah, right.
But I then learned pretty quickly that it could become its own brand, I suppose. So I kind of embraced it, and it became its own thing. It took on its life of its own. Yeah. And now Dr. Happy is almost a separate entity to Dr. Tim Sharp. And I try to use it in the right sort of way.
In the right sort of way. Because it's funny, because I have met one other doctor who called himself Dr. Happy. That was in Venice Beach, but he was handing out cannabis cards. Yeah. So that's maybe not the place we want to go. But anyway, I'm curious to know, why has happiness become such a focus, especially a focal point for science? Clearly, with your background in clinical psychology, you're typically working with people that are experiencing, either whether it be depression or issues in their life that they're affecting their performance just in life in general. But is this something that people naturally come to you saying, look, I want to be more happy, or is it typically I want to feel less depressed?
Well, look, both. So there's a couple of questions in there. I'll try to break them down. First, I get asked a lot, why is happiness such a focus now? Why are we spending so much time thinking about it? And my response is, it's not really a new focus. Forever, people have been thinking and talking about living their best lives, happiness. I mean, you've got every major religion, every great spiritual or philosophical leader in some way or other has touched on it. They might have used slightly different words or phrases, but the ancient Greek philosophers talked about it in different ways. So the pursuit of happiness is not really a new thing. One thing you did say, what is new, is the scientific study of it. Again, positive psychology is a relatively new discipline, i.e. 15 plus years. And before that, and again, I did 3 degrees in psychology, and I don't say that to boast, but in all of those years, I didn't study happiness once. We spent years and years, and the only thing we focused on was stress, depression, anxiety, where people were going wrong in their lives. And look, that's really important. It was I thoroughly enjoyed and found very satisfying my clinical psychology years. It's very, there are people out there suffering depression, etc., and we need to help them. But what a few people started to ask, and Marty Seligman was probably the most famous one, but there are a whole bunch of other people around at that time, that, for so long and by we at that point, they were talking about psychologists, but obviously other disciplines are involved. But, they said for so long we've been saying, what's wrong with people and how can we fix it? What if we actually ask what's right with people and how can we make more of that? And that was so Marty mentioned something like that in his speech as president of the American Psychological Association in 1998. And that was the start. And over the next few years, this idea of studying, thriving and flourishing as opposed to misery and distress and dysfunction, what if we did that? And positive psychology, I should know, isn't just about happiness. In fact, there's even some positive psychologists who don't like to use the word happiness because they think it's misunderstood. And it's really about living our best lives, or what technically we refer to as thriving and flourishing. And one part of that is positive emotion, like happiness, but there's lots of other parts to it as well.
Yeah, right. Because it's interesting. One of the things that I've learned about my own psychology is whatever I focus on, I get more of. Whatever we focus on expands, which kind of points to the fact that, if someone's depressed, but they're constantly talking to other people about why they're depressed, it only kind of makes sense that it's going to create more depression. So has this actually crossed over now at a therapeutic level where, we don't just have practitioners now that are sitting down talking about why people are depressed and psychoanalyzing them and finding out why they're depressed, where they're actually working on and helping them focus on the things in their life that are going well, that has been, in some cases, what you're telling me, the science has proven to actually create greater states of happiness, and in many cases reduce depression as well.
Yeah, definitely. A really important point. And one of the, one of the early questions or issues within positive psychology, one of the realizations, I suppose, is that historically we had this idea, again, we as clinical psychologists had this idea that, and I'll just talk about depression, but it can apply to any other form of dysfunction as well, I suppose. But the assumption was if we take someone who's depressed and we take the depression away, then everything else will be fine. But it doesn't really work like that. If you have something that's not, if you have something that's bad and you take it away, you just get not bad. You don't necessarily get good. So taking away depression or resolving depression or anxiety doesn't necessarily lead to happiness. It's a good start. It's an important start for some people, but there's a lot more we need to do to take someone not just from -10 to 0, but from 0 to +10. And you're 100% right. A lot of the positive psychology principles are now infiltrating their way into therapy. So there's actually a movement called positive therapy, which builds on a lot of the really good stuff we did before that. And there's a lot of really good work through, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the cognitive behavioural therapies, etc. So we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. A lot of that's really, really effective.
Very helpful.
But we've sort of added another dimension to that. Certainly a lot of people are. And even another sort of contemporary version of that, acceptance commitment therapy, or ACT, is again almost a type of positive therapy or positive psychology approach in some ways. And I think that's really important because as important it is to help people overcome depression, anxiety, etc., we also need to help them do much more. I mean, I don't want to, and I don't want my kids to lead just an okay life that doesn't have depression. I want them to live a great life that has happiness and joy and success.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you heard of Tony Hsieh. He runs a company in the US called Zappos, and he has written a book called Delivering Happiness, and his whole psychology around customer service and business is, delivering the customer happiness, creating incredible cultures that, generate happiness within their culture, that generate high levels of performance. And I'm trying to remember the actual statistic, and I think it was from memory, but please correct me if I'm wrong, because I think it actually came from the positive psychology movement. But from memory, it was a very high statistic. It was something like 78% of people who, if you're happy already, you are 78% more likely to experience a success in your life. Is that like, am I close to it here? Or
I'm not sure exactly what research you're referring to, but the essence of what you're saying is definitely true. We know that. So what we know is that positive emotions, and again, happiness is just one of them, but positive emotions are much more useful and beneficial and important than just making us feel good. Yep. And historically, I mean, that's historically why people didn't study happiness, because they thought it was just kind of this nice thing.
It was an emotion.
Just a nice emotion
on the spectrum
that didn't really have much importance.
Yep.
But what we now know, largely due to a woman called Barbara Fredrickson, who led the research in this area, she actually developed a theory called the broaden and build theory of positive emotions, which in short explained or posited that, yes, it's nice to feel happy, obviously. It's nice by definition to experience positive emotions, but it's actually much even better than that than we realize, because what happens when we experience genuine positive emotions is that we have this phenomenon called broaden and build. So by that, our minds literally broaden. We become more open-minded.
More aware, more conscious.
More aware of everything. We see more alternatives, so we're better at problem solving because we come up with more solutions, so we're also more resilient, etc., etc. But we're also more able to build on both our internal and external resources. So by internal resources, our strengths and talents and attributes, we can use them better when we're experiencing positive emotions. We're also better at collaborating and asking for help and using other people. I don't mean using in a manipulative way, but in a positive way. So again, that broaden and build when we experience genuine positive emotions. And I should say, we're not going to feel like that all the time. But if we experience more positive emotions, then we're more likely to have this broaden and build, and we're definitely more likely to be successful. And this has definitely been proven in workplaces.
And what's interesting, I find, is because obviously a lot of my work is in the area of performance, human performance, and also business performance. But oftentimes I'll sit down with someone and say, are you happy? And they'll go, yes, but they're clearly not looking happy. But then we'll say to them, okay, so why do you do what you do? And they go, well, to ultimately have more time, make more money. So if you had more time, had more money, what would you do? Well, if I had more time, I'd do this. And if you're able to do that, what would that give you? Don't have it. Well, I'd get this. And if you're able, and ultimately I've got to the end of it and I'll say, well, I just want to be happy. And it's almost a bit of a gestalt for some people where they don't actually realize that you actually don't need more money in order to be happy. It's really just a perspective. So what do you think it is that prevents people from having that shift and thinking, well, it's a destination. Happiness is a destination. I've got to get somewhere. I've either got to find the right mate. I've got to get the right job. I've got to have this amount of money, drive this car, live in this suburb. Why do you think people put happiness so far outside of themselves when in reality, from what the science tells us and even what philosophy has told us for thousands of years, it actually lives on the inside?
Yeah, look, really good question. And I've experienced exactly the same phenomenon multiple times over the years with various clients in different contexts. I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, so I often do this in some of my keynotes or talks. I'll often ask an audience, how many of you would like to be happier? Even if you're happy now, how many of you would like to be happier? And 99.9% of people put up their hands. Sometimes there's one person asleep by that stage. So, but obviously, no matter how good things are, we'd like things to be better. So everyone wants to be happy or happier. But what I'll then sometimes say is, how many of you have a happiness plan? And depending on the audience, and I speak to all sorts of different people in different contexts, but typically, you might get 10% of people. Now, if you don't have a plan, you're not going to achieve something, or you're far less likely to achieve something. So that's one of the first problems. Although most people want it, they don't really know what it is. They've never actually sat down and defined it, and they don't know how they're going to get there. Now, if you don't know what something is and you don't know how you're going to get there, it's just like a financial plan or a fitness plan, or if I want to run a marathon and I've never actually run before, I need to sit down and work out how am I going to do that this week and next week and build up to it. Or if I want to lose weight or whatever it might be, is that if I want to create wealth, I need to have a savings plan and a wealth creation plan.
So is it fair to say that happiness is like a muscle? Like we need to actually exercise it if we want to experience more of it?
Well, partly. So happiness it's a complex phenomenon, and it means different things to different people. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of people don't even know what it is. But
that's what I was going to go next. Like, what is the baseline? What is happiness, and can we measure it?
Definitely. Psychologists, despite what some people think about psychologists spend a lot of time measuring things. So there's actually multiple measures, but there's also multiple definitions of happiness. So I'll break it down into the two simplest ones. The simplest one we've already touched on, and that's that happiness is just one positive emotion, along with a range of other positive emotions like joy and contentment and satisfaction and pride, etc. So that's relatively easy to measure. We can measure our moods and our emotions in different ways, but that's not all happiness is, because if all we did is focusing on feeling good, that's a bit like hedonism or narcissism almost, and we know that's not really the long-term answer. Feeling good's important, but it doesn't really go deep and it doesn't really last long. So really what positive psychology is about is not just feeling good, not just the positive emotion part of happiness, but it's about living our best possible lives, or as I said earlier, thriving and flourishing. And that definition actually has multiple components. So that involves positive emotions, but it also means having meaning and purpose in our life, which is important. It involves living a physically healthy life, so exercise and diet and sleep. Involves the right sorts of attitudes, very much involves the right sorts of relationships, so feeling connected and like we have a sense of community around us. So when you put all of those things together, that's what positive psychology is really about. And some of those things will take, setting meaningful goals and working towards meaningful goals isn't always easy. Sometimes there'll be blood, sweat and tears. So we won't necessarily feel happy and joyful every minute of every day, but we know that it's going to be worth it in the end. And that's a different type of happiness.
Yeah, right. So it sounds to me like, from what you've said, most people's expectations of happiness is unrealistic.
Definitely. And to come back to a point you touched on earlier, and I don't mean to blame these other sources because we need to take responsibility, but we're fed all sorts of myths and misconceptions all the time. You touched on a few of them. We're told repeatedly that if you have more stuff, you'll be happy. If you have more money, you'll be happier. If you wear this particular brand of clothing or drink this particular type of drink. And although, if you ask someone in a calm, rational state, do you really think wearing that particular type of jeans or drinking that particular type of soft drink is going to make you happy? That's, of course not. But we get sucked into this because we're told this thing thousands of times a day, every time we pick up our smart devices or every time we watch TV or go online. And so it's hard to it's hard to resist that sometimes. So we get sucked into buying that new thing or spending that more money or even going for that job or taking that promotion that we don't really want, but we think, well, it's going to be more money, so I can't say no to that. So those things aren't bad. I mean, money's not an evil thing, and material possessions aren't bad things, but we need to understand what they are for what they are. And
the purpose of them.
They serve a purpose, and they can be great in some contexts, but they won't ultimately, not long-term and not deep, really give us that sense of happiness so many of us desire.
And it's interesting because like minimalism is becoming quite a movement. And what's interesting now is looking at the minimalism movement and also the correlation between increase in joy and happiness. Is there any science that you've seen around that so far that's coming out?
Yeah, look, I'm a big fan of the minimalist movement, and it's it's consistent with a lot of what psychology has really been saying for years. I guess it's just using a slightly different language. But, although I should say, I think it's often misunderstood. I mean, my interpretation anyway of the minimalist isn't that it's not that we shouldn't ever buy something or we shouldn't ever spend money. It's not sort of anti-capitalism, I don't think. But what it is saying is every time you go shopping or every time you think about buying something, you've got to ask yourself, is it really going to add value to my life? Because so many of us have so many things that don't really add value. I mean, I've read research that says the average person only wears 30% of their wardrobe. The average person in Australia and across the Western world throws out significant amounts of food at the end of every week. So we're clearly buying things that we're not using and we don't need, which is not necessarily helpful for a variety of reasons. So I think also with happiness, it's what we need to think about, and this is where the minimalist movement's really useful, I think, is so often we think about what we want more. We want more of this in our life. We want to do more of that, and that's fine. Sometimes we forget about what we should have less of. And I think this is what I take from the minimalist movement is what do we need to take out of our lives, both psychologically and physically, I suppose, to free up more time to focus on the really important things like our relationships.
Yeah, right. And what I'm curious to know is, has happiness for some people become so much of a focus that it almost becomes addictive in nature? And does that then lend itself to the possibility of, well, in order for me to be happy, then I need to have a drink, I need to smoke or take a substance? Like, is there any correlation between substance use and happiness and addiction? Is there?
Well, yes and no. I think there's a couple of things there. But one part of what you touched upon is this misunderstanding that happiness is just about hedonism. So it's just about pleasure. Now, pleasure is not a bad thing at all. In fact, pleasure is a great thing, and it's great to have fun. It's great to enjoy life. But what we need to understand is, one, that's only part of happiness, or it's only part of living our best life. And two, we also need to understand that some pleasures have side effects. So drugs and alcohol, for example, can certainly bring on a pleasurable state, but for how long? And what happens afterwards? And what are the consequences if you take it for too long, etc. And so clearly, that's an issue that some people struggle with.
And it's one of the things I'm seeing, obviously, with the advent of the internet and the access to information, a lot of people have this microwave mindset. They want everything in 60 seconds. And that's where one of the things I'm seeing, not just in social circles, but I'm seeing this in business as well. Like addiction is becoming a real issue. It's something that I believe has always been there, but it's something that's becoming more and more. And I think oftentimes it's because people are looking for that quick fix. They are looking for, well, how can I feel happy, just by within 30 minutes without having to do any work other than just swallow a substance. So when we look at the practical nature of positive psychology, what are some of the things that we can do on a day-to-day or a moment-to-moment basis that will increase our levels of happiness, first and foremost, and then we'll maybe look at, like, how do we sustain that? Because I think, again, it's that microwave mindset. If I can't get it instantly, I'm not interested. And one of the things I've learned, anything worthwhile in life requires a pursuit, and anything that is going to be of, greater benefit, you don't just pursue it once. It's an ongoing pursuit. So what do we do, and what can we do to get there, and what are some of the simple things we can do to sustain it?
Yeah, I think you've hit on a couple of important points. And you touched on this a little bit earlier when you talked about the journey versus the destination. Yeah. I think, this has been an ongoing debate, not just in positive psychology, but in philosophy for ever almost. And people sometimes ask, so is happiness, an end result that we should aim towards, or is it about the process? To be honest, I think it's both. I don't think we can ignore either, because we need that end destination. I think it's helpful to have that that goal to aim towards, whatever that might be, and it will definitely be different for different people. So, I generally think it's very important for everyone, if they're going to live their best possible lives, they need to know what that best life looks like. What does it actually look like? What would it feel like? What would you be doing day to day, week to week, if you were living your best possible life? If you don't know what that looks like, I think it's very unlikely you'll ever get there. But as you quite rightly said, that's not going to happen tomorrow. or for most of us, it's going to take weeks, months, years, or a lifetime, often a lifetime really. And it will even change a bit along the way. So what we also need to do, as well as having that nice, that powerful, hopefully inspiring image or whatever it is that we're aiming towards, we also need to learn to enjoy every step along the way. Because if we don't, we're going to be waiting 50, 60, 70 years to suddenly or hopefully experience something. So, and we also need to enjoy some of those unexpected or unplanned detours that come up along the way. I don't know about you, but some of the best things in my life have happened by accident.
Yeah.
I've always been, I've had quite clear goals and plans, and I think that's really important in lots of ways. And I've coached and worked with many, many people. I've helped them to do the same, set goals, work towards that. But I've always said, don't get so rigid or stuck on that you lose sight of that thing that might be tucked around the corner or that you didn't expect to happen, that accidental meeting that might turn out to be your wife or a business partner or whatever. So getting that balance, and look, like all these things, it's easier said than done. But I think hopefully the answer to your question is finding that balance between the destination and the journey, and
having a plan to get there. One of the things I've learned, you talk about, bad things go wrong, and that's one of the things that we've learned. Life is, I think it was Buddha who said it best. Life is pain, suffering is optional, which I think goes really hand in hand with with what it is that we're talking about right now. Because we can't avoid the failures in life, we can't avoid the things that go wrong, but we do have a level of control around the meanings that we create when they happen, and even post event. Because hindsight's this beautiful thing where in most cases an event will happen, someone will look at it and will go, oh my God, that was the worst thing that could have possibly happened to me. And then fast forward 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years later, they then look back on that event and go, holy crap. If it wasn't for that event, I wouldn't be right. That was the best possible thing that could have ever happened to me. So when we consider hindsight as being such a potent tool for regulating and managing, our psychology, how can we perhaps bring that into an everyday practice that might support us in the moments where shit is hitting the fan, things are going wrong, we're high stress, and we perhaps need more of a clearer head to be able to get out of the situation that we're in? How can we bring hindsight into the moment?
Well, again, I'd preface it by saying it's easier said than done, because when we get caught up in the emotions of a traumatic or negative event, it can be hard. But the simple answer, one-word answer I'd say would be mindfulness. Now, I'm guessing a lot of your listeners would have heard of mindfulness. It's one of those ostensibly simple strategies that can be just absolutely super powerful, and I'll explain a bit more now. So
just for basic though, just for someone who's perhaps heard of mindfulness or heard of meditation, going, well, are they the same thing? What is mindfulness?
So it's not exactly the same as meditation, but so mindfulness is, there are, like a lot of things, there are multiple different definitions, but the definition that I usually use is non-judgmental observation with curiosity. So what that means is when something happens, our first response often is, oh, that's good or that's bad.
Which is normally followed by an emotion. It jades our perspective.
Which then leads to a whole lot of other things. If it's bad, we get upset. If we get upset, then we engage in whatever behaviours. But as you quite rightly said, that thing that seemed bad at the time, a week or a month or a year later, maybe wasn't quite so bad. And there's a phenomenon within, a psychological concept that's particularly consistent with positive psychology called post-traumatic growth. Now, a lot of people have heard of post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And we often assume that any sort of trauma or any negative life event will be an unpleasant, unhelpful one. But it's actually not true, because as you said earlier, you're 100% correct. The majority of people, trauma can be stressful. There's no doubt about it. It can be very distressing. And PTSD, is a highly distressing, disabling condition sometimes. But for the majority of people, or significant number of people, if you ask them, have you ever experienced a negative life event? And all of us have in some way or other. If you then ask them, did you, a week, a month, a year, or 10 years later, have you ever looked back at that and thought, although it was unpleasant in some way or other, it made me stronger, wiser, more mature, better? And 99.9% of people put up their hand. We've all been through that, where it was, maybe it was horrible at the time, but we learned something, we grew out of it, etc. And if we can, so this is part of what we're doing, if we can remember that, and then, as I said, bring your hindsight to the present moment through mindfulness, if we can. And it's very hard to do at times, but like a lot of things, with practice, we can get better at it.
It's like a muscle. We can develop it to become instinctive and reactive.
So if we can actually get to a point where we can say to ourselves, okay, this has happened. Is it good or bad? Well, I don't really know yet. Let's wait and see. And let's see what we can do with it or learn from it. There's actually, if I've got a few minutes, there's a famous ancient...
Good or bad, hard to say.
The Chinese farmer story of...
with the horse, yeah.
Should I tell that, or you...
We literally covered it 2 episodes ago, but please give us the abridged version for those who perhaps missed that episode.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, so it's a famous sort of Chinese ancient wisdom story, but so basically there's a farmer who has horses and a family, and anyway, one day his favourite horse runs away, and the neighbours come in and say, "Oh, that's terrible. You've lost your favourite horse." Oh, I don't know. We'll wait.
Good or bad, hard to say.
Good or bad, hard to say. The next day, his favourite horse comes back and brings with it a whole herd of other horses, and they say, "Oh, you're the luckiest man in the world. You've got all these horses." Good or bad, hard to say. The next day, his son tries to ride one of these wild horses, falls off, breaks his leg. The neighbour comes around. "Oh, you're so unlucky, poor son." Good or bad, hard to say. The next day, so I'm going through this quickly, but the next day the local army or militia comes around, takes all the young men from the village away, but not his son because he's got a broken leg, and they say, "Oh, you're so lucky not to lose your son." Good or bad, hard to say. Anyway, it can go on, but I think, it's a great story, and it really sums up.
Drives the point, though. There is a balance to everything. There is a duality to life. And oftentimes in the movement, when things happen, there is a high amount of emotion. And if it's a negative emotion, in order for us to maintain that momentum, we have to block out all the positive aspects of what's going on in that moment. Or if it's a positive emotion, we have to block out all the negative aspects of what's going on in that moment. And for me, one of the things that I've learned is the real freedom in life comes from that mindfulness, being able to step back, in a painful situation or a traumatic situation or a high stress situation and go, okay, good or bad, hard to say. Let's look at both. And
definitely, I just the risk of disagreeing with you, just pick up on one point. I think it's not about blocking out these emotions, and I think that's a mistake some people make about denying them. The fact is they're real. But there's a whole lot of different.
A better word, perhaps regulate.
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of metaphors that are used to help people understand the mindfulness concept, I suppose. And one of them, for example, is, or one of the simplest ones, you're standing on the side of the road and a bus comes by. You don't need to get on. You can choose whether you get on or not. If you get on, then that's like holding on to that emotion, or you can just let it go past, and that emotion will drift past.
Oh, I love that.
Or clouds in the sky, and imagine a perfect blue sky, and this cloud floats along. You can watch it. You don't need to grab hold of it. So it's the same with emotions. We know that emotions will come and go. It's really up to you whether you want to latch onto them or not.
Do you think one of the challenges that people have when it comes to experiencing higher levels of happiness is perhaps we were never actually taught how to regulate emotion. We were never actually taught how to regulate stress. And so, we experience an event and we experience an emotion, but we don't actually have, whether it be the mental capacity or in some cases even the physical capacities in order to regulate.
Without a doubt. And this is something that's very topical for me at the moment. This is something I'm so passionate about. I spend quite a lot of time talking to schools, not as much to the kids, but a lot to teachers and parents. Sometimes I talk to the kids, but I've got a couple of parent talks coming up in the next few weeks, so it's very fresh in my mind. Plus, I have a teenage son.
How old?
He's 15. He's going through this stage of experiencing some quite intense emotions, and I'm trying to teach him how to regulate it. But to come back to what I often say to parents, because I would go so far as to say that as a parent, this is one of the most important things you can teach your kids. And because I come in often as Dr. Happy from the Happiness Institute, they're often expecting me to say, this is how you can make your kids happy. And sometimes I surprise them by saying, well, I don't think that should be our primary goal as a parent or as a society. Yes, we'd love our kids to be healthy and happy, but they're not going to be happy all the time. None of us are happy all the time. That would be absurd almost to think. It would be actually pretty weird to think of someone that's smiling and happy every minute of every day. And certainly particularly our teenage children, for a variety of reasons, are not going to be. What's more important than trying to help them be happy all the time is, as you quite rightly said, to manage or regulate those emotions, to understand that, it's obviously great to feel good and to be happy and to be loved and to love, etc. But we're going to get angry, we're going to get frustrated, we're going to feel anxious and stressed and sad. These are perfectly normal, at times appropriate emotions. What we need to do is, rather than trying to banish them or we don't want to tell kids that it's bad to feel like that. What we want to say is it's okay, but here's how you can regulate it. Here's how you can make sure that that anger doesn't lead to punching a wall, or that anxiety doesn't stop you from engaging in life. And that's a really important difference.
So where does the process of teaching someone how to regulate start? Because, I've read a lot of information. I'm an addict, and one of the things that I've learned is my brain developed very differently than other brains based on the level of trauma and the amount of trauma that I experienced as a child. And so as a result, I learned that as a post result, I learned that I regulate emotions in a different way. My brain processes information in a different way. And I've since learned that one of the most important roles of a parent is to nurture their child when they are experiencing high levels of stress, especially as a toddler. And I think oftentimes we confuse a child's meltdown as a cry for attention that we need to avoid, versus then actually giving them a level of safety that's going to help them develop in a healthy and productive way. So, what responsibility do we as parents have, and when does it start when it comes to showing our kids how to regulate emotions and stress?
Oh, well, we have an enormous responsibility. I mean, the simple answer is that the parent is the most important person in that child's life for quite a few years, for probably quite a few decades, I guess. Parents, whether we like it or not as parents, and we sometimes don't like it because it's a lot of responsibility, but we're the most important role model that child will ever have.
Yep.
And so our children will, most of what they, not necessarily 100%, but most of what they learn will be through watching us. Watching how we respond to distress, how we respond to difficult circumstances, how we bounce back from adversity. So we have an enormous and a very important role to play. And when does it start? Well, from the very beginning, really from day one. I mean, obviously, in the pre-verbal stages, it's a different sort of observation or learning, but they're still observing, they're still watching you, and certainly more and more as children go from babies to toddlers and then to little people, increasingly in how we talk to them, how we teach them to talk to us, etc. The extent to which we set up boundaries, help them to learn boundaries and rules, etc. That's vitally important. And look, as you said, I think when our kids get upset, and of course they're going to get upset, we need to understand that they're not born with a full-grown capacity to deal with this stuff. None of us were. Some people find it easier than others, and great. They're just like. Some people are better singers or better sports people, or some people are better at emotional regulation just naturally, and that's fine. But, most of us need to learn at some stage. And I suppose one of the things as parents is to try and be patient and forgiving and not expect our kids to get it right all the time from day dot, but coach them along the way. And this is what I present a lot to parents. You're very much like a coach that you need to help them bit by bit, step by step, hopefully grow into the sort of person that they can and you can be proud of.
So if a parent up until now has been completely ignorant to the fact that they've got an enormous responsibility to teach their kids how to regulate emotions and stress, whether they be a toddler or a teenager, is there any blanket advice that you could give to parents to say, apart from demonstrate how to regulate emotions yourself, which is probably the biggest challenge, but probably one of the most important challenges. But is there some tools or techniques that a parent can use when they see their child is in stress, they see their toddler is in distress, to say, okay, perhaps if you try 1, 2, 3, this might help you get through this?
Look, it's. I suppose I'll go back to something you said earlier about how you described the way you've learned to manage or regulate emotions is different to other people. And I think, so one thing I'd say is everyone is different. Yeah. And that's important. So every parent's different. Parents will have slightly different styles, and every child's different. So I have 2 children, for example, and they're quite different personalities. And, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, my wife and I, we deal with them differently because they're different people with different styles, etc. So that is important. I guess every parent needs to find their own way, and every parent needs to approach their children in a way that hopefully works for that particular child. But
you're right.
It is difficult to give blanket advice because we're all different. But the few things I would say is if I have to sum it up to one word, I'd say love. Which might sound a bit corny and a bit general, but the research suggests that if we can create a nurturing, safe environment for our children, that is probably the most important thing. So how do we show love? Well, again, we show it differently, but whatever love means to you, show it as often as you can't over-love a child. You literally can't. You won't make a bad child if you give it too much. And some people are afraid of that.
I don't think you can over-love anyone.
No,
because
exactly.
when you look at even intimate relationships, one of the most, and I was even just reading something before you came in about how, people in loving relationships, in often cases will live longer. They're better able to regulate stress. And what we're essentially doing with our children, we're in many cases also doing with our partners as well.
Yeah, you're 100% right, and I think so. It's not just about children; it's about any important person in our life. But I think sometimes there is a myth that I think some parents are scared that if they love their child too much, they'll spoil them.
Yes,
spoiling's a totally different thing. I mean, that maybe that's another discussion. But genuine love, authentic love, where our children feel safe and as I said, comfortable. You can't have too much of that at all. And then the other part of that, or the important part of that, is communication. we've just got to keep talking to our kids. And that's hard because not all of us learned how to do that when we were growing up.
Yeah.
Not all of us had parents that were good communicators. But what I often say to parents is you don't have to get it right all the time. Doesn't matter if you stumble over a few words. Doesn't matter if you stuff it up every now and then. What is important is that our kids know we'll be there for them, that we'll, through good and bad, that we'll keep trying. I mean, I stuff it up all the time, but I literally said to my son the other day, I said, look, I know I stuffed it up, I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep trying.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's there's a couple of important messages. Hopefully he heard me, that I'm going to keep trying, but also hopefully he learned that, and this is important, that I'm not perfect. And that I don't expect him to be perfect. And that's important as well. I think sometimes or certainly historically, parents probably thought they had to put on this perfect image. They didn't want their kids to see any faults or failings but I don't think that's helpful actually. In fact, the opposite. I think it's helpful for my kids to see that I'm fallible, I make mistakes, but this is how I recover. This is how I try to deal with them.
And I also think it's important to point out to parents what communication is. Communication isn't telling what our kids to do. It is conversing with them to achieve a common goal.
Well, it's probably, so at the moment with my son, for example, what's more important is listening. He doesn't really want to hear from me. He doesn't want to at all. He's told me so. But what he does want is for me to be there and listen. And it's hard sometimes because I'm sort of thinking, well, I know what you could do and here's the answer. He's not always looking for answers or solutions, and particularly for me because he knows what he does. He doesn't want me to be the psychologist.
Yeah.
He wants me to be there and just to listen. And I think we sometimes, not just with children, but in other areas, we forget the power of listening.
I used to do that with my ex-wife. Like sometimes she would, end of the day, and she'd start unloading. And I learned this really valuable process. And I'd ask the question, do you want me to fix or do you want me to listen? And I think listening, and again, in any consultative approach to life, it's one of the most important things. So we've talked about some great stuff around, not only finding happiness, but creating sustainable happiness. We've talked about, got to have a happiness plan. We've got to know what are the things that we're looking for, becoming more mindful. And also the use of love, which I've got to tell you, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I don't think anyone, let alone people we care about, but just humanity in general, the more love we have, it's not going to do us any harm. Communication is great. But what about when it comes to the things that we do every day that perhaps we're unconscious of that could be affecting the way that we feel, especially when it comes to our joy and our happiness? What about like diet, nutrition, hydration? Does that play a role as well? Oh,
without a doubt. So there's no doubt that our physical health and well-being is integrally linked with our psychological health and well-being. And, one of the core components, one of the pillars of living our best life is our physical health and well-being. So, getting adequate sleep is often underrated or forgotten, but it's vitally important. Sleep is so important to our...
Sleep's becoming quite sexy now.
Well, my first book was on sleep, and it's the best-selling book I've written. It's such a big... 8 out of 10 people at some stage in their life will have difficulty sleeping. It's a massive problem. So many of us don't get enough sleep, and then we wonder why we're tired and frustrated, wonder why we're not performing our best, etc. So, I used to talk about sleeping your way to the top, which used to get a few giggles, but it was to try and make that point that really, if you talked about performance earlier, if you want to perform at the best you can, well, you can't possibly do that if you're sleep deprived. So sleep's important. Diet, nutrition is obviously important. I mean, these things we live in require appropriate nutrition and sustenance. And again, unfortunately, too many people don't. I mean, the average Australian, I think it's only about 10% of Australians eat the recommended levels of vegetables every day. That's atrocious, a terrible figure. We know the figures about obesity, etc., and increasingly in our children, which is a problem. So, but the other one is exercise, which is obviously, most people know about that, but too many people think about exercise just for the physical benefits, getting big biceps, getting a six-pack or whatever, and obviously it can do that, and that's great, there are advantages to being physically well. But what a lot of people don't realise that exercise is one of the most potent and effective antidepressants we have. For me, it's probably almost certainly my best antidepressant and stress buster. I go to the gym pretty much every day, and without it, and every now and then I can't, but if I go more than a couple of days, I notice it. I really notice it.
Because it does give us that uplift of, dopamines, endorphins, and the oxygen, and there are so many good ingredients.
Oh, well, there's that. There's a physiological component to it, but there's also that sense of achievement.
Yeah.
For me, it's also a form of, almost a form of mindfulness. I mean,
definitely.
When I'm in the gym, I have quite a bit of an overactive mind, a lot of an overactive mind sometimes. But when I'm in the gym, it's one of those places I can just, all I'm thinking of is that next rep, that next set. So for me, it's one of the few places I can just, I don't think about anything else. I don't worry about anything else.
What about, are there any particular foods that, that if we are looking to become more happy, that we should perhaps avoid because they can potentially, give us the feelings that we don't necessarily want?
Oh, look, yes and no.
I know it's going to be an individual thing, and it's always around moderation as well. But for some people, moderation is not even something they understand.
It's actually a really exciting area, this idea of the relationship of food and psychology. But it's also a fairly new area, so I'm just going to be a little bit cautious because the science is very young. But there's some pretty exciting research, and I think in the next 5 or 10 years we're going to see some really interesting research about specifics of what will either boost or detract from our mood. But at the moment, the key findings are pretty general, and basically what they just say is eat a good diet, which we should all be doing anyway. So by that I mean, you've probably heard the mantra, eat mostly real food, and by that I mean not packaged stuff, not processed stuff that's actually come from a tree, been dug out of the ground or been killed, whatever. So real food that doesn't have numbers or fancy chemicals in it. Mostly vegetables, as I said earlier, this is where a lot of people go down, and not too much of it. What we're seeing is the biggest problems are people are eating too much processed food, which has high levels of salt, sugar, etc., and that just can't be good for anyone.
And what about too often? Because intermittent fasting is something I've been subscribing to now for a couple of years. But there also seems to be some early experience and very, very immature data coming through that even fasting has the ability to regulate mood and give us better, make us feel better.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I've actually recently been involved in writing the psychological content for a new fasting diet that's just been launched actually. So
perfect, let's
very
do
hot
it.
For me. Am I allowed to mention what it's called?
Yeah, please. Plug away.
The super fast diet has just launched a month or so ago.
So you're an intermittent faster yourself?
I've tried it a bit. I guess I've come up. Yes, I have tried it, and I've come to my own version of it, and that's one of the things I liked about Superfast Diet is that it offers a number of varieties. So most people are probably familiar with the 5-2.
Yep. That's
kind of the most famous one. But I didn't quite realise up until like 6 or 9 months ago, there's all sorts of different variations.
Lots of schedules, yeah.
Yeah, so what they sort of recommend people try it out and see what works for you, and you can mix and match a little bit. But you're 100% right. What there's some really exciting research, I think, and it is in the early days that shows it can be helpful for weight loss. It can definitely be helpful for health and well-being. There's some early research that it could be good for longevity. So there's something about
early onset Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease. It's like there's nothing but good anti-aging. There's nothing but good news about it.
Exactly, and that's why I'm quite excited. I researched it very carefully before I got involved because I'm not a fan of most quote-unquote diets.
Yeah.
But this is quite different.
But this is more lifestyle based. Like when you look at the purists of it, and I'm a purist. Like I typically do the 6-18.
Yep.
So I'll fast for 18 hours a day, have a 6-hour window. I've been doing this now for 2 years. So for me, I'm well and truly into my journey. I've been fasting for 16 years before that, like 7 to 10 day water fast. And what I've experienced, but this isn't just about health. This is when it comes to business. This is when it comes to, most people treat this stuff like it's a bloody event. They don't treat it like a lifestyle. And one of the things that I like about the intermittent fasting schedule is you can eat the same things you ate if you wanted to. You can eat the same amount of food. You're just doing it in a different time frame. And when it becomes a way of life, losing weight becomes easy. Becoming smarter becomes easy. Becoming healthier becomes because it's what you're doing every day, not what you're doing every now and then.
Yeah, 100% right. And that's again why I liked it. It is very much about a lifestyle rather than just a 12-week program that I'm going to, so I can lose 5 kilos or whatever it might be. And definitely, I've mostly tried the one that you described, and I suppose my favorite is I tend to eat a lot less at night time, and I will often go to bed not starving, but just a little bit hungry. But I find I sleep better, I wake up more with a clearer mind, and I think what I've seen, because I've actually worked in this on and off for like over a decade now in various types of sort of dieting type approaches, and one of the things I've found, people are scared of being hungry. There's a lot of people who are fearful of that sensation, and it's not necessarily, I'm not advocating anorexia or eating disorders or starving.
You wouldn't be.
But but I think for a lot of people, we've forgotten what it's like, and that's not necessarily
and it becomes
a normal
uncomfortable.
thing.
But again, this is like failure, and this is what I had to teach myself. Is I taught myself that being hungry wasn't a bad thing. that when I'm hungry, my body is actually healing, that when I'm hungry, my brain is becoming sharper. When I'm hungry, all these amazing things are happening at a mitochondrial level that are making me a better human and more performance. And once I shifted over to that, because again, it's when you go to the gym for the first time, you start lifting your weight and you're like, oh shit, this is starting to hurt. I'm going to put the weight down. It's like, no, that's what you want. You want to look at your association with pain. What does pain mean? What does hunger mean? And do you think that's maybe part of the challenge for some people?
Oh, without a doubt. Again, it's about... I suppose it's about seeing that bigger picture. And I think you're right, and seeing a lot of the advantages. And like you, I found clarity of thought is a really positive side effect that can come from, again, we're not talking about starving yourself for days and days or weeks, but just, we're talking about a couple of hours, really.
Yeah.
And for most people listening, I think, they're not going to have difficulty finding food if they need it. But yeah, that clarity and for me, again, better sleep and a whole lot of other benefits that come from it. It's it was really quite exciting when I first discovered it a while ago.
I'm so glad that you're into it, because for me, it's real. Like we've got most of our clients are on intermittent fasting schedules now, and the beautiful thing is it's not a one size fits all. You can find a schedule that's that's right for you. But I am curious. I think happiness has become one of those things where people often search for it. In a pill, in a glass, in a relationship, in a car, in a house. But we've also seen the advent, from my perspective, and I hope I'm not, going somewhere that might be uncomfortable for you, but I think we're living in an age where there's a lot of overprescription of drugs, especially when it comes to antidepressants. I know when you look at the pharmaceutical statistics, especially around the different antidepressant drugs, these have become a very hot commodity to be able to move off the shelf and create billions of dollars for some of these companies. Now, without going into the conspiracy aspects of it, I am curious to know, though, is there a level of overprescription when it comes to, is there an overdiagnosis and overprescription of certain drugs when it comes to things like depression?
Without a doubt, and I'm more than happy to talk about it for a number of reasons, one professionally, but also personally. I mean, one of the things I haven't mentioned yet is that, but it's something I've started to speak a lot more openly about in recent years, is that I've suffered depression on and off for most of my adult life, which comes as a surprise to most people.
Not at all. That would make sense. Like you're pursuing something that's close to you, that's close to your heart.
Well, it didn't really come about like that, but that was sort of a...
All right, I was clearly way off base.
well, maybe we can talk about that later. But depression, in some ways, is just as important to me as happiness.
Yeah.
And which is why, and particularly in recent years, I've become a very strong advocate for mental health and trying to help more people be honest and open about it and talk up, and particularly men, dare I say it, because we're pretty crap at that a lot of the time, and asking for help, etc. But maybe we'll come back to this, but to come back to your question, there's both, like a lot of things, there's a good side and a bad side. One of the better things we've seen in the last decade, or probably a couple of decades, I suppose, is an increasing awareness around mental health, increasing awareness around depression, anxiety. More GPs, for example, are getting trained in it. More people are familiar with it. We've seen, organisations like Beyond Blue and Black Dog, etc. Raise the conversation, and so most of the time that's a great thing. So more people are coming forward, more people are putting up their hand, more people are presenting to GPs. The dark side of that, although I think some of the negative sides of that, is that I think more people are being overdiagnosed. So some people with normal variations of mood are being diagnosed. I definitely think too many people are being prescribed. Now, that's not to say no one should ever be on antidepressants, but there's no doubt at all, I don't think anyone would disagree that there's it's just the easiest option. But the easiest option isn't always the best option, not long term anyway. So we do have, and again, without getting into too many conspiracy theories or whatever, we do have a multi-billion-dollar industry, and like any other multi-billion-dollar industry, they're going to do what they can to sell a product. And I think there are some unfortunate consequences of that, which are very hard to deal with, because it's a very powerful machine that's out there now.
And we're dealing with highly addictive drugs that have, a lot of consequences with, over time with use.
Well, it can be. I mean, one of the myths that was sold is that these things didn't have side effects, they weren't addictive, but that's more recently been proven not necessarily.
Well, we just got to look at the aftermarket. Some of these drugs have an incredible value in the aftermarket, from a recreational perspective now. But I am curious to know, like for people who perhaps are wondering about going to the doctor, or the doctor has told them you need a pill, is there a better way to prevent overdiagnosis at the individual level, where they can go to the doctor and say, well, is there perhaps a different test other than your opinion that you can give me, maybe to test chemical levels in my blood or my brain, that would give me greater indications of whether or not it is perhaps a logical next right step?
The simple answer is no, not at the moment, for a number of reasons. But the answer is also that may well be possible in the next 5 or 10 years. I mean, I think, again, we're going to see rapid increases in things like genetic testing and individual biological or physiological testing that'll, go towards. So there's talk about, being able to perfectly individualize a diet, for example. So by taking a blood test or a genetic test, we can know exactly what you as an individual need, and stuff like that. But I think that's still a good few years away, either for weight loss or diet or things like depression. But the other part is, and this is a bit controversial, but I feel quite strongly about it, and I've researched this quite heavily, so I'm pretty confident. I don't believe there's any strong evidence that depression is due to imbalance of chemicals in our brain. I think this is a myth and a misinterpretation of the data. Now, that's not to say that we don't all have. Our neurochemicals and neurotransmitters are different, and they vary from time to time and day to day, and I'm not saying they might not vary in certain ways that might in some way contribute to our moods, etc. But I don't believe there's any strong evidence to say depression is due to a lack of serotonin or a lack of dopamine or whatever it might be. I really think that's actually a myth that's been perpetuated.
And so what do you think depression is? Is depression merely a perspective that has become so ingrained and so habitual, so pattern-driven that they just don't know any other way to think?
Well, so on the one hand, depression is a normal human emotion. And this is something I've particularly had to learn and have come to accept more and more. That for me, I think, when I first, the worst parts of my depression were quite a few years ago now, but it still rears its ugly head on a regular basis. But early on, my goal, I suppose, my idea was to try and beat this thing, to try and win the battle. It's not a battle you can win. It's not a fight you can win. And increasingly, I've learned to come and accept this is part of who I am. Now, I don't want it to take over my life, and I don't like it when, there are times when I struggle to get out of bed and can't do the sorts of things I want to do, but not as much anymore because I've learned to manage it well. But I think we need to see, to a large extent, that depression is a normal human. We've I think to a large extent, in a lot of cases, we've turned a normal thing into something that's abnormal, and that's not necessarily a great idea. That being said, it can definitely be quite crippling and debilitating for a lot of people, myself included at times. And what is it? Well, it's, at the risk of getting sort of technical, it's a biopsychosocial phenomenon. It's a combination. There's no doubt there are biological influences, genetic probably and hereditary influences. We don't really know what they are yet, but they're probably there. And at some point we might know what they are. And so we might be able to have pharmacological or genetic interventions that will help with that. But I don't think we're there yet. There's definitely psychological factors. So depression is or clinical, major depressive disorder, the technical term we use, is a combination of low mood, poor sleep, dysfunctional cognition, interpersonal relationships that aren't working, etc., etc., etc. So it's a multifaceted phenomenon. It's not just low mood. People forget that sometimes. But then it's also very much a social phenomenon. And this is a bit that's often left out. When we look at people with depressed, they often talk about feeling disconnected, feeling lonely, feeling different. And that's often not addressed, that social aspect. And that's a pity because, so I remember, when I first had my early bouts of quite severe depression, I thought I was the only person in the world. No one would understand me. That's why we don't talk about it. We think we're weird or unusual in some way. And yet, if you look at the statistics, I definitely wasn't the only person in the world. In fact, I was probably surrounded by people, but I didn't know it because they didn't talk about it, and they didn't know it because I didn't talk about it. So we feel, and this is why the movement that's grown over the last few years about telling stories, lived experience stories, is so important, I think, because, and this is why I tell my story. I mean, I don't necessarily think people will be that interested in me as an individual, but if they can hear that there's one other person who suffered depression, but still gone on to live a thriving, flourishing, successful life.
This is what makes you real. I think this is what people connect with. Like, people connect with the individual, they connect with the vulnerability, and the fact that you are Dr. Happiness who has experienced depression, that to me makes you more attractive as a professional because you can actually relate. You can connect to the experience of the people who perhaps look at the happiness, science, and go, well, I want more of that, but how could he ever understand me? I'm feeling depressed. If he's all happy, I think that's your gift.
Thank you. But I'm not happy all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone will be. And this is, again, people sometimes surprised when Dr. Happy from the Happiness Institute says, you won't be happy all the time. That's not a negative thing. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. It's a reality. And again,
it comes down to those realistic expectations of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, I suppose what I've also done and what I try to help other people do is to actually find beauty in some of that misery, which sounds weird in a way. But when I look back at I mean, some of my saddest moments have also been my most important learning moments. A lot of my experiences have helped me be more empathic and understand other people, and that's led me to, thankfully, do some important work, I suppose. So, if we can find the good in the bad, which is a bit Zen, I suppose, but the
duality of life,
the light within the dark. Because sadly there will be dark, and for some of us more than others, but we'll all have some of it. And if you can again see this, so there's a Japanese concept you might well be familiar with called wabi-sabi, which is about finding the beauty in imperfection. And we are, despite the fact we don't like to think about it sometimes, we're all imperfect, and life is imperfect, but some of that can actually be really beautiful.
Well, I think that's where the beauty actually comes from, is the imperfections in life. And I know from my own personal experience, one of the reasons I've been able to reach the amount of people that we have, and one of the reasons I've been able to help, in some cases, many youths with drug addiction, is because they can relate to me, and they know that I'm not just talking about a concept. I'm talking about something that I've actually lived. But I am curious to know, though, if there is certain supplements that perhaps, because we've talked about diet, we've talked about exercise, we've talked about mindfulness and having a plan, love, communication. But there's two areas we haven't gone to yet, and before I hit the last one, the first one I want to talk about is about supplementation. Are there any supplements that perhaps we can take, whether it be vitamin B or vitamin C or a vitamin D, on a regular basis that will not necessarily increase our happiness, but perhaps support the probability of happiness being easier to come by?
Oh, look, I probably should qualify this by saying it's probably a bit beyond my area of expertise. I mean, I'm a clinical and coaching psychologist. I'm not a nutritionist or a dietitian.
No, that's fine.
But it is something I've had a personal interest in and looked into. So there certainly are a number of products out there that make claims. I think there are a few question marks around some of the claims that are made. What I would, at the risk of maybe being a bit too maybe vague or general, what I would go back to is, in an ideal world, we would just eat a good, balanced, nutritional diet that would cover that. Now, the reality is we don't all do that for obvious reasons, so there may well be some supplements that for different people will work. But again, I think it'll come down to the individual, and I guess what I'd say is probably see an expert, go and see a qualified nutritionist or dietitian, look at your diet, and if there is a gap there, then fine. Maybe you can fill that gap with a supplement, and that may well be useful for you.
Meditation. We haven't talked about it, but it's been a passion of mine for about 20 years. I've seen an enormous amount of research come out of especially the transcendental meditation movement. And what happens, not just at a biological but a biochemical and a neurochemical level of the brain. Has meditation proven to be, either in soft science or hard science, as something that can actually support happiness at a greater level?
Without a doubt. I often say it's one of the... And so I meditate every day, at least once a day, sometimes twice a day, depending...
You do TM or...?
No, I do. Well, I do a couple of different versions, but usually just breathing techniques, I suppose, focusing my mind, breathing techniques, sometimes with some muscular relaxation involved in that, sometimes with some visualization. So I've got a couple of different... I've done this for many, many years. So I suppose what I've done is combine bits and pieces from different that work for me. I've kind of created my own version, which I encourage other people to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there are lots of different styles. Yeah. And I always say, I don't think there's one perfect one. I usually encourage people to go and try a few different ones and then create their own version. But I do, and I don't do it for that long. So I do 10 minutes pretty much every morning. Yep. And then I'll sometimes do another 10 to 15 minutes every morning, and then another 10 to 15 minutes sometimes through the day if I can. Yep. And for that, if I often say to people, if you could massively improve your life in 10 minutes a day, would you do it? I say, of course I would.
Meditate. I can't do that. I don't know how. I tried it. It doesn't work,
exactly. And for such a, I was going to say simple. Look, it's not as easy as it sounds, but with practice you can get better.
Neither was lifting a weight when you first go to the gym. And I say this to people, they go, I tried meditation, my mind's too busy. And so, well, when you first picked up a 20 kilo barbell, could you lift it? Well, no, that's the whole fucking point. Excuse the French. But we've got to learn, it's a muscle. We've got to learn how to develop it over time.
And again, like any other skill, could you drive a car perfectly the first time you got in it?
Exactly.
Well, of course not. Most of us almost crashed the first few times, but or any, typing or whatever it might be. So to come back to you guys, there's absolutely no doubt there's a lot of science that shows it's incredibly beneficial in almost every way you can imagine. And there's virtually no side effects. There's virtually no negatives to it. So it's massively helpful. But it is, some people do struggle with it more than others, so it does require practice. But there are a whole lot of myths and misconceptions that get in the way of people. And one of them, so some people think they've got to totally clear their mind, not think about anything else for 10 or 15 minutes. Well, you don't. Part of mindfulness meditation is accepting your mind will wander from time to time. And
that's the point.
That's it. Sometimes I'll go 10 minutes and have the most blissful, almost out-of-body experience. Other times I'll just be thinking crap all the time. Yeah. But that's part of it. There's good and bad days, and getting used to that is part of it. But sorry, to come back, there's absolutely no doubt it's helpful. I recommend that there's not one person that I wouldn't recommend it to. But as you said, unfortunately, not everyone either gives it a go or gives it enough of a go to get to the point where they actually experience the benefits.
I think if we look at some of the core issues in society, a lot of it comes back to discipline and the ability to learn how to apply ourselves to difficult things for extended periods of time in order to reap the rewards that we're looking for. There is one other aspect that I wanted to talk to you about, which is talk track, auto suggestion. The conversation that we have with ourselves, that little voice in our head. Oftentimes, one of the things I've observed in psychology, some people either talk about it or they don't. But I am curious to know from your perspective, because I often say to people who has I'll be doing an event, I say, put your hand up if you've got a little voice in your head. And 80% of the room will put their hand up, and I'll say, and for those of you who aren't putting your hand up, you're sitting there saying to yourself, I don't have a fucking voice in my head. Everybody has a voice in their head. I guess the question is, number one, how conscious and aware are you that of it when it is there? And number two, how conscious are you of the fact that you programmed it to say what it's saying right now? So I'm curious to know from your perspective, based on all the science, is there anything that should really motivate us to start becoming more conscious of the things that we say to ourselves on a regular basis? And do those things, are they literally do they become self-hypnotic prophecies? Are they a form of self-hypnosis through the use of self-suggestion?
So without a doubt, as you said, whether we realise it or not, we all have that going on.
Yeah.
That internal self-dialogue, whatever you call it. There's a whole bunch of different words. I mean, I grew up, most of my professional training was in cognitive behaviour therapy or cognitive therapy, so we use slightly different language, but exactly what you've been describing. Is there why should people become more mindful of it? Because it's so bloody important. There's absolutely no doubt that, so that voice is not just inconsequential. It's super important. That little voice, whether you're aware of it or not, impacts on the way you feel, what you do, so therefore how successful you are, how you interact with other people, how you interact with yourself even. That little voice, I mean, according to my training, is really the heart and soul of everything. That contributes, again, to our mood, our behaviours, our relationships and our life. So if you're not aware of it, then that's going to be having effects that you're not even aware of. And so you're probably not living your best life without even being aware of it. By becoming more aware of it, why should we do it? Because by becoming more aware of it, we can have more control over it. And this is the thing. So you're right. We've largely pre-trained that, and to some extent our parents and other people have. So wherever we are now, that's come from partly ourselves, partly our significant others, not just parents, but teachers and all sorts of other influences. But that's what it is. But what we all have the ability to do is decide what we're going to say from here on in. So obviously I can't change what happened to me 10, 20 years ago. What I can learn to do, and just like these other things we've spoken about, it is a skill that requires practice and can be very hard at first, but we can get better at it. And the first step is definitely awareness, because you can't change something if you don't know what it is. So if that little voice is chatting away and you're just ignoring it or pretending it's not there, well, good, bad, or whatever, you're not going to be able to do anything about it. It's going to continue to influence your life whether you like it or not. But we can do something about it. We can learn to talk back to it. We can learn to change. Again, there's all sorts of different metaphors or words that are used, but the bottom line is we can learn to change the way we think about things, and if we do, we can change our lives.
Beautiful. I've got to say, this has been, I want to get back, I'd actually like to bring you back in so we can actually have a whole session perhaps on depression, because one of the things that we've discovered with the work that we do with business owners is depression in business seems to be at epidemic levels. We've never seen, higher rates of mental illness coming out, in the areas of entrepreneurs and business as well. But with what we've talked about today, Dr. Tim Sharp, it's been a real honour and a great pleasure to have you in here.
Oh, thanks a lot. It's been fun. Thank you.
Cheers, mate. There you have it, guys. Thanks for tuning in to Unstoppable with me, your host, Kerwin Ray. And do me a favour, don't forget to drop me a review on iTunes. Would love to hear what you think. I love reading what you guys have to say. And your reviews make sure we keep creating killer content just like this. If you want to stay up to date with me and all my movements, please jump onto the website, kerwinray.com. And also check us out on social media at Kerwin Ray.